About a decade ago, I was here. Professor Tolbeck was retiring. That's what I heard. 10 years later, he's not retired. Now, 10 years hence from now, he will still be around. He wouldn't have retired. So I want an implicit commitment. Implicit commitment from Professor Ndulo that 10 years from now, he's going to invite me back to Cornell University.
Sure.
Talking about commitment reminds me of what I said a decade ago during the retirement celebration. I said the best way to spell commitment is THORBCKE. And I still mean that. You heard a lot yesterday from Steve Younger and other people. I wish to also take the opportunity to thank him. In March 1998, just before I went to AERC, he invited me to Cornell. And it was a pleasure. Let me take the opportunity now to thank him and also his wife, Mrs. Tolbeck, for hosting me. That is something I very much cherish. Now, back to the topic at hand. When iad was talking, I was sitting down praying really hard. Please don't say everything. Leave me something to say. Mercifully, he did. In this sense, I would like to concentrate on the role of inequality, income inequality. One thing I've learned is that inequality means different things to different people. So here I want to talk about income inequality. I won't say a whole lot about growth, but I'll say something about implications for poverty reduction. And I would like to put the evidence in a global context. Outlines are meant to actually be prepared and forgotten. People try to be very impressive. Outlines tend to be more impressive than actual presentation. I don't want to be that imposter. All I want to do really is to talk about the evidence of the role of inequality and other things in terms of transforming growth to poverty reduction. I think all of us have come to believe from Art Cray and Dollar that really poverty is the engine. So growth is the engine for poverty reduction. And it also turns out that growth is the main ingredient in terms of human development, in terms of my own studies, in addition to governance. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about that. But if we look at the global evidence, we find out that the role of inequality differs a great deal across countries. On African countries in particular, and I wrote a few studies, we also again find that inequality varies a lot in terms of its importance. By the way, Andy, inequality is important, but it varies a lot across countries. Yes, there has been a resurgence of growth, but it is not just growth, after all, as Andy indicated. In a recent paper that I wrote, and thanks to the OECD, I found that, again, inequality growth varied a lot across countries. And there's a background paper for this presentation. And if you'd like to take a look at it, you can go to the CSAE place. You can go to WPI, BWPI, UNU Wider. They are there at the website. Now, here's a picture of the growth. As they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Here it is. There's no doubt that the growth resurgence began in the middle of the 1990s, the kind of middle to latter part of the 1990s, after disastrous performance in the 1980s and the early 1990s. And if you look at the more recent evidence, it's quite clear that sub-Saharan Africa actually has outperformed the world's high-income OECD countries and other economies. But that's aggregate. How about the poverty picture, poverty record? Again, Andy gave some evidence on this using the Povgal net, the World Bank data, that he so much trusts. Now, if you look at the by the way, I could have provided the 2008, but it doesn't change the story at all. Yes, between the early 1980s and the present, there's been no change in the poverty rate. Here we're talking about the headcount poverty rate. By the way, I'm not going to say anything about multidimensional poverty. However, if we look at the more recent period since the 1990s, a whole different story emerges. And I'm comparing the evidence with that for South Asia and India. The evidence shows that more recently, in the case of the $25, the percentage point reduction is about 7 percentage point for both regions, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Similarly, at the 250 level, it's about 4 percentage points for both Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. In addition to that, let us note that, and again, if we can believe the World Bank data, that the poverty rate at the 250 level is actually higher in South Asia, not in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's higher in South Asia. South Asia has been trying to catch up, but hasn't succeeded. More recently, it is still about 4 percentage point difference. It is lower in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, inequality. Again, if we can believe the inequality data from the World Bank, we note across regions that the most unequal region is LAC, Latin America and the Caribbean, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa, but it's distant second, by the way, it's distant second. And the lowest is the Europe and Central Asia, I believe, followed by South Asia. Let's keep these data in mind as we interpret the subsequent results. Now, we are going to do some quantitative studies. I know that Andy was waving his hands as he was talking about the implications of growth for poverty reduction. But I'm not going to be waving my hands. I'm going to provide empirical evidence. And here, this is the usual Bourguignon identity model, where we have poverty, growth of poverty, as a function of growth of income and changes in inequality. To what extent can the growth of income and changes in inequality lead to poverty reduction? So that's the equation that we want to estimate. And what we're interested in really are the elasticities. That is EY, which is the income elasticity, and EG, which is the inequality elasticity. G here represents Gini. So whenever we think about G, we think about inequality, Gini. And here we proceed and use the usual estimation methodology. By the way, I promise I'm not going to show any regression results. I will not show any results at all, regression results. But after going through the process of estimation, I end up close to about 400 observations for the 250 and $25, a little bit over 320 to be specific, across 123 countries around the world. So I obtain equations 4 and 5, which are the elasticities. And they represent, by the way, there may be non-economists among us. And this is simply the ability of growth or income changes to reduce poverty. That is the income elasticity. And inequality elasticity, the ability of decreases in inequality to reduce poverty. That's what they are. So in equations 4 and 5, let's take a look at equation 4, for instance. The income elasticity is negative because we expect income growth to reduce poverty. But we also notice that GI which is the initial Gini, initial inequality, has a positive sign, suggesting that a higher level of initial inequality reduces the ability of income growth to reduce poverty. Okay? Similarly, Z over Y, Z is the poverty line, and so if you turn it around and you get income Y over the poverty line, it will be negative, suggesting that a higher income relative to the poverty line will tend to increase the ability of income growth to reduce poverty. So the statement that Andy made earlier, waving his hands, here it is, quantitatively, in terms of the role of income on the ability of income growth to reduce poverty. Similarly, if we look at EG, which is inequality elasticity, it is positive because we expect reducing inequality to increase. Reducing inequality, increasing inequality to reduce. Reducing poverty to reduce poverty. Let me say it again. Reducing inequality to reduce poverty. Okay. So it's a positive sign. So if you increase inequality, you tend to increase poverty. And the GI shows that increasing the initial inequality will tend to reduce the ability of reduction in inequality to reduce poverty. Okay? And similarly, a higher income relative to the poverty line will tend to improve the ability of decreasing inequality to reduce poverty. Are we there? I hope so. Okay. So let's keep these relationships in mind as we interpret the results. So now we can look at income elasticity that is computed globally and across regions, and we find out that the greatest one is in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, mainly because of high incomes and also relatively low inequality. Now, we also find that Latin America and the Caribbean has a high elasticity, not because of lower initial inequality, but because of higher incomes. And Sub-Saharan Africa has the lowest elasticity because of higher inequality, but more importantly, because of low incomes. Similarly, we find the results of inequality elasticity being largest Latin America, in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, followed by Latin America, and lowest in Sub-Saharan Africa. So let me emphasize that the ability of reducing inequality in terms of reducing poverty, or the ability of increasing income growth in terms of reducing poverty, will tend to be lowest in Sub-Saharan Africa. That's essentially the point. The graphs essentially indicate the same. Similarly, if we look at Sub-Saharan Africa, it's lower income elasticity, even though the level of inequality is lower than Latin America, for instance. That's the distribution. Elasticity as a function of inequality of the Gini. Similarly, we have the results showing the high elasticity for Latin America, even though it has a high inequality, mainly because of the high income than Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, among countries. Note again that inequality varies quite a bit across countries in Africa. And we note income elasticity being highest in South Africa. Why? Mainly because of the high income in South Africa, even though it has a high level of inequality. And on the left-hand side, we see Ethiopia, which is ETH, which has a lower level of elasticity, income elasticity, even though its inequality is lower, right? But because it has a very low income. We have similar results for the inequality elasticity, so I will not belabor the point. What I want to do now is to try to decompose the behavior of poverty over time over income growth and inequality growth. That's what I do here. And here we have 24 sub-Saharan countries in a global sample. And these are all countries that show reduction of poverty between the 1990s and the present. And the present differs across countries, depending upon the availability of data. In some instances, you have 2009 as late as the present. In others, you have 2005, and so on and so on. We note, for instance, that in Cameroon, there was a substantial reduction in poverty. That's POVG. I don't believe you have a red arrow. Okay, anyway, we can see the Cameroon. Okay, that's fine. So that's the major reduction, that's POVG. And then the A column represents the contribution of income. And it shows that income growth led to a reduction in poverty. And it's quite significant. And on the B, that's inequality. The contribution by inequality changes. And again, we find out that inequality reduces poverty for Cameroon. Similarly for Ethiopia. Indeed, for Ethiopia, we find out that the inequality is actually a more important instrument for poverty reduction than income. Ghana is mainly income. Indeed, because there was a rise in inequality, it tended to dampen the effect of income growth on poverty reduction. Uganda. Once again, the story is like Ghana's story. That income growth led to reduction in poverty, but there's also an increase in inequality, which tended to dampen the effect, the impact of income growth. Note, among the 24 African countries, only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 had poverty increases over the period. By the way, someone from South Africa might raise a great objection. And this was done at the ILO when I made a similar presentation. That, well, why is South Africa down there? Well, South Africa was down there until very recently. Now, most of the reduction in poverty in South Africa has actually happened since the 21st century, beginning of the 21st century. And I'm in the process of revising the data, and South Africa will move up to poverty reduction, although it is going to move in the 6th decile of the global distribution. I'll say a little bit more about this later. Tanzania, similarly. But again, we find if we take a look at the means, we find out that the instrument for poverty reduction is on average income growth, not inequality. We find that here and here generally as well. What I want to do here is essentially emphasize some of the stories that I told earlier using some simulations. In the case of Tanzania, one of the reasons why there was not so much poverty reduction, despite the fact that there was a high growth of GDP, let me emphasize GDP, is because GDP growth tends not to actually reflect income growth. It tends to overstate income growth. I haven't said a whole lot about this. In the global story, I say more about India as an excellent example, but this is not the global story I'm telling here. Now, if indeed income growth had been at the same level as GDP growth for Tanzania, we would have observed a significant reduction in poverty. That's the story. I've already mentioned Cote d'Ivoire, where we find out that rising inequality was mainly responsible for what occurred in terms of increasing poverty. So rising inequality hurts. Let me go back and show you the Cote d'Ivoire story. There was increase in poverty, but if you look at A, it shows that income growth implicitly reduced poverty, right? But because inequality rose significantly, we ended up with poverty increasing instead of being reduced. So now back to the Cote d'Ivoire story. If indeed there had been no rise in inequality, poverty would have fallen by close to 8%. Not the increase in poverty, would have fallen instead. Ethiopia is the counterexample. The fact that most of the reduction in poverty was due to reductions in inequality. Now the final story. Burkina Faso versus Chile. This is my favorite story. Burkina Faso and Chile had essentially the same level of initial inequality, right? They did. At the same time, the growth in income was about the same over the period between Chile and Burkina Faso. In addition, inequality fell much faster in Burkina Faso than in Chile, close to about 3% compared to about 0.6% for Chile. Yet, what do we find? We find out that poverty fell much faster in Chile than in Burkina Faso, 8% annually versus 3%. Why? It seems like a paradox. Simply because the elasticities are much lower in Burkina Faso than in Chile, a point that Andy made earlier. If indeed we had assigned the same level of income of Chile to Burkina Faso, we would have seen splendid outcomes. We would have had a much greater decline in poverty by about 23.6%. By the way, all these are in annualized values. Let me conclude, to summarize. Yes, income growth has been very important in poverty reduction over the period, but we found out that there are major differences across countries, that initial inequality has indeed mattered, and so have changes in inequality. The initial inequality will say something about the ability of changes in income growth for reducing poverty, whereas reducing inequality generally would tend to reduce poverty. That income levels also matter. So countries, low-income countries, can actually do very well in terms of poverty reduction programs. And yet we see very scant results. Why? Because they're disadvantaged to begin with. It is a point that Revalian is now coming to embrace. Overall, the evidence really provides a roadmap, if you will, at least in this case, for the African experiment, but we can also talk about the global experiment in terms of whether it is inequality or it is growth. I've not said anything about policies, have I? Now, it turns out that, by the way, I'm going to engage in slightly small promotion here. There are two books out there recently published by the Oxford University Press on country role models for development success. And there are a number of very good strategies from both developed economies and the developing world that you might want to take a look at. Bunch of policies in there. Also, there's a most recent paper by Professor Thorbeck on the topic. If you want to see virtuous or spiral circle, read the Thorbeck paper. Finally, I'm sure there must be a lot of things going behind our heads right now, especially students. So what led to reduction in poverty in Ghana, in Uganda? Why is inequality such an important story in the case of Ethiopia? Go out there, make your hands dirty, look for the evidence, write your thesis on Ethiopia. There will be many, many theses in the next decade. Thank you.